Hi everyone, I just want to welcome you to ME 124, the Materials and Mechanics Lab. Let's now go through the agenda for this first class. So topics within this first lecture, we want to go through the syllabus, explain what to expect for this coming semester. Then we're going to get into our schedule and see the breakdown of when our lectures are, when our labs are, and when things are due. And these will all be posted to Blackboard as well. Then we're going to go through the labs and the grading, how each of these labs will be graded and what's to be expected for each of the labs, go through those rubrics. Then we're going to take a look at Blackboard, see how we're going to use Blackboard. This is going to be the primary source of communication throughout the semester. Now, a thing I want to mention here is there's going to be two separate Blackboard pages. You're going to have one Blackboard page for the lectures, and then you're also going to have one for each of the lab sections. So the primary source of communication is going to be through the lecture Blackboard, and this is where you're going to find all the modules, all the resources posted up here on this one, your class announcements. But the assignments and where you turn in your labs, this will be done through each of the individual lab sections when you turn in your group lab reports. And the last thing we're going to go through is talk a little bit about lab safety and then get into some information on COVID and what we're going to do as things progress throughout the semester. So now I want to get into a little bit more detail about this course and take a look at the course description. So within this course, we're going to introduce a couple different things. One of the main things that we're going to work on within this course is the experimentation. So there's going to be 6 different labs throughout the semester, and we're going to get some hands-on experience going through using lab equipment and running these experiments. The next thing we're going to discuss within this course are the engineering measurements. So this becomes very important as we're running these different experiments of how we take these measurements, how we record those measurements, how we use those measurements into our calculations and our lab reports. Another thing that we're going to discuss within this course is data analysis in terms of our solid mechanics. So a lot of the information, governing equations that we've seen in our previous courses within your ME curriculum will come back, and we're going to use these as a basis for how to do the data analysis from the data that we are collecting within each of these 6 laboratory experiments. Another thing that we're going to introduce within this course is instrumentation for dynamic measurements. So we're going to discuss different types of data acquisition systems, and within these different lab experiments, we'll have different types of data acquisition systems associated with each of the experiments we're using, each of the pieces of equipment that we're using. We'll talk about different ways that we can collect that data and how we can utilize it, what our data acquisition rates need to be for each of these different experiments. We're also going to get into some lab experiments where we're looking at photoelasticity, and this will be one of the first lab experiments within the semester. And a good portion of this course, we're going to be taking a look at actual mechanical testing, and I'll relate this back to some of the actual work that I've done within my research. Another thing we'll be introducing within this course is the heat treatments of engineering materials, and we'll tie this into a couple of the lab experiments as well. So looking through everything that we're going to be talking about within this course, I do want to come down here and mention that there is a prerequisite of ME 101. So this is a course you either need to have taken already or are currently taking, and if that is not the case for you, please reach out to me immediately, because the materials that we're going to be doing within this laboratory in this course are going to be dependent upon your knowledge of ME 101. Now I want to take some time and look into the details on the course information for ME 124. So first thing I want to take a look at is the lecture portion of this. So there's going to be a lecture portion and a lab portion to this class. For the lecture portion, this is going to be a remote lecture, and this is going to be a live synchronous lecture through Teams on Wednesdays throughout the semester. So again, the location would be through Teams for the live lecture, but a lot of supplemental information will be posted to the Blackboard page as well. And as I mentioned, Blackboard will be the primary source of communication for this class. Now the second portion, like I said, there's a lab and a lecture. The next portion we're going to talk about here is the lab. So the lab location, this is going to be in person on campus, and this is going to be in the materials lab in the room 246 in the Vody building. Now we've broken this into 5 different lab sections throughout the semester. So lab AO1 is going to be on Mondays from 10 to 11:45. Lab AO2 is going to be on Fridays from 10 to 11:45. Lab AO4 is going to be on Wednesdays from 10 to 11:45. Lab AO6 is going to be on Wednesdays from noon till 1:45, and Lab AO7 is on Thursdays in the afternoon from 3:15 till 5 p.m. Now again, this course is broken down into the lectures and the labs. I am going to be teaching the lecture section of this on Wednesdays. Again, this is going to be remote as a live synchronous lecture through Teams. I'm Dr. Burns, and my teaching assistant, Brandon Gamble, will be running the labs in Vody in 246 for these 5 different lab sections. Now, Brandon will also have office hours that will be announced a little bit later on towards the beginning of the semester. And just to reiterate, again, Blackboard will be the primary source of communication for this course, and there are, again, 2 sections of Blackboard, one for the lecture and one for the labs, where the primary source of communication is going to be that lecture Blackboard, while I'll be posting all the modules throughout the semester, any supplemental information. Again, as you can see here, distribution of lab handouts and lecture notes, things of that nature will all be posted up through Blackboard. So now I want to get into a little bit more detail for the grading and deliverables for this course. If we're talking about the grading, we're going to break this into 3 different sections. You're going to have your laboratory reports, your laboratory notebook, and your final exam. So the laboratory reports are going to count for 72% of your grades. This is going to be the bulk of your grade for the semester, are these laboratory reports. Now these are going to be divided into 6 lab reports, each worth 12%. Now you can see there's also going to be this peer review adjustment for each of these lab reports. We'll get into the details for this a little bit later in the lecture. Now the next portion of your grade is the laboratory notebook. This is going to count for 8% of your grade. And again, I'll get into the details of what I'm expecting for this laboratory notebook a little bit later. The last portion of your grade is the final exam, and this will be a cumulative final exam that's going to be multiple choice online through Blackboard. As far as the details for these laboratory reports, we'll be getting into some more information regarding what I'm expecting for the setup, layout, report, rubric, and I'll also be providing you supplemental material such as templates through Blackboard as well to give you a great reference of how to create these reports. Now again, these reports you're going to write as a group. So if you look at the rubric and you look at the template that I give you for the lab reports, you can see how you can break it down so that each individual team member might have a different section. So one person might be responsible for the background section, one person might be doing the conclusion, one person might be doing the calculations. So that leads us into the next step here, our peer review. So for each of these 6 lab reports, there's also going to be a peer review that you will be turning in at the end of each lab report. And what you'll be doing in these peer reviews is you'll be reviewing yourself as well as your teammates for everybody's contribution level on that individual lab report. And what that'll allow us to do is to address any deficiencies and problems that an individual within a group may have. And it might be something where you were really busy that week and you had a couple other exams or a couple other projects in other classes and you just didn't have the time to contribute. Well, in your peer review, please note that, because again, you're ranking yourself as well as your other teammates. You can say, okay, you know, I just didn't have the time, I waited to the last minutes, and I did not do the quality of work that I would have liked to do for this lab. And then you know to adjust that as you go into the next lab. And this is also going to lead in if you're one of the types of students who like to wait to the last minute to do the work. Then maybe you want to think about when you're breaking up the individual tasks for these lab reports where you might want to do the conclusion section so that the other team members are not waiting for your work to write their sections. So again, we'll get into a little bit more detail with this peer review, and you'll have a look at the template that I've provided on Blackboard for what this peer review is, and these will be after every lab report. So then we'll talk about the lab notebook, and again, this is 8% of your grades. The lab notebook, you're going to be using this to make any notes throughout the calculations of your experiments, labs 1 through 6. You'll take it to every single lab with you, write down notes about the data you've collected, any calculations you've done, any governing equations you're using, graphs. So this is your opportunity to have something in hand while you're live doing the labs and put down any notes so that when you go back and start writing these lab reports, you can look at this notebook and say, oh, that's right, we had the temperature setting a little bit off, or oh, we started this late, or whatever it might be. You have those notes from the live experiments that you can then use for your lab reports. And again, the last portion of your grade is the 20% for your final exams. This is going to be an overview, a basic review of engineering theory and techniques from the laboratory. So anything we've done throughout the semester as far as our lectures or in the laboratory experiments could be fair game for this exam. Again, this will be an online exam through Blackboard. Both myself and the TA will have office hours scheduled throughout the semester. So I have set office hours on Wednesdays from 9:30 a.m. till 10:30 a.m. Now, if the extra help is needed, you can also feel free to contact me via email as well if you can't make it to the Wednesday office hours. But I've purposely put these office hours right after our lecture. So if you guys have any questions related to content, material that we discussed in that lecture or the upcoming labs, that's a great opportunity while it's fresh in your mind to come to my office hours to ask any of those questions. Now, I do want to note that these are going to be virtual office hours and they will be held using Microsoft Teams. So you'll have access to these through your Microsoft Teams calendar. And again, the TA will also have office hours scheduled this semester, which will be announced coming up soon at the beginning of the semester. And this is the opportunity if you have any specific questions related to the labs, the grading of the labs. The TA, Brandon, will be doing the grading for these labs. So if you have grading related questions or what he's expecting for individual sections for the lab reports, that'd be a great opportunity to discuss those with Brandon as well. So I'm also going to provide you with the schedule for the semester right from day one. I don't want there to be any surprises. I want you guys to be well prepared coming into each of the labs and know when your reports are due and when each of the lectures are going to be scheduled for. So I've broken it down in the schedule, and this again is posted to Blackboard as well, so you'll have access to this. Now it's a little bit different than previous semesters due to the fact that there are 2 weeks in a row where there is going to be a university holiday or recess that's going to prevent us from doing any other labs that week because at least one of the labs would not be able to meet. One of those lab sections would not be able to meet during those 2 weeks that I've highlighted here in blue. So these 2 weeks, there's not going to be any labs. I've tried to color coordinate this for you to make it easy to follow along. So if you get down here, you can see that on President's Day holiday, and the next following week is going to be the town meeting day recess. There's not going to be any labs because, again, 2 of those days of the week, there's going to be no classes, which means the lab section would not be able to meet that day, so therefore none of the labs will be able to meet during those weeks. So that does technically give us 3 weeks in a row where we do not have any labs because you got the President's Day holiday, town meeting day, immediately followed by spring break. Now, we will still have a lecture on one of those days, but there are no labs in those 3 weeks. So now what we're going to do, let's go back up to the top here and we'll start from the beginning for our schedule. So first week of classes, you can see, yes, we are going to have a lecture on that week on Wednesday. So all the lectures will be on Wednesday of that week. And the topic for the lecture I talk about here, so this is going to be what we're doing right now, our introduction. And we're going to get into our first lab experiment, Lab 1A. Now you can see there are no labs this first week of class, but we are going to be covering Module 1 and Module 2. So I've broken down our Blackboard into 15 different modules, and now you can see here how these modules relate to each of the weeks of classes. So you can see again, for this first week of classes, we're going to be doing the introduction, which is Modules 1 and Modules 2 on Blackboard. So again, there's a lot of resources and supplemental information I've provided on Blackboard for you, as well as these live lectures through Teams. So that's week number 1. Then we get into week number 2. And you can see here's the starting date for week number 2, and we're going to have, yes, there is a lecture, and there is your first lab that week. So in lecture, we're going to be talking about Lab 1B, but in the lab experiment section, our lab topic here is Lab 1A. So you can see we talked about Lab 1A the week before that you go in and actually perform that experiment. And that's why I've scheduled this for the semester, is the previous week you're going to be talking about, we're going to be going through the information for the lab you're going to have the following week. So you get into that, and this is going to be in the lab, and you go to Blackboard, and that's going to be your Module 3. So we can go down through the whole semester, and you can see which days we're going to have and which weeks we're going to have lectures, which weeks we're going to have labs, and you can also see for each of the lectures what the topic is going to be for the lecture, and for each of the labs, what lab experiment we're going to be running, and how it relates to the Blackboard modules. And again, one thing I do want to note is I am encouraging you to please go ahead before you go into lab, before lecture, look at these modules. Again, there's a lot of information, a lot of reference material I've provided there to let you know what we're going to be doing. So you can ask questions during live lectures. So live lectures I really want to use for that back and forth conversation. So please prepare ahead of time, understand what lab topic we're going to be discussing, what lab you have going on that week, and bring those questions with you to the live lectures on Teams. Now you can also see there's another column over here which talks about the deliverables, so you can see when each of these lab reports are due. Now, a note I want to talk about here, let's just talk about lab report number 1. So lab reports, all the lab reports are going to be done in your group. So your team is going to complete this together and turn in one lab report for each of these. So again, there's 5 different lab groups throughout the semester, each one a different day of the week or a different time during the days of the week. So the date that you'll be turning this in is on the end of the day that your lab section meets. So again, each lab report turned in as a group, one report per group, and you're going to turn it in through your lab section on Blackboard on the day, the end of the day that your lab meets for your experiments. Now, as I mentioned, I'll be giving these lectures, and they're going to be online, asynchronous lectures once a week posted to Blackboard. So the purpose behind these lectures is to give you guys a little bit of the relevant background and your theory for the upcoming experiments that you'll be running in the lab with the TAs. So what theory should you remember from your previous courses? So I'm going to be highlighting some of the stuff you may have seen in earlier courses, not going through in extreme detail because this is stuff that's going to be a little bit of a refresher for you and just remind you of things that you need to draw from. Because as you notice, there's no textbook for this course, so you're expected to be utilizing some of the textbooks from your previous courses. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the technology that you'll be using and how it works as far as the laboratory equipment goes, what measurements you should be taking throughout the labs for your data analysis, if there's any sources of errors, what those should be, and what calculations you should be completing, and a couple of the key equations associated with that. So that's kind of what you can expect from the lectures. It's just kind of an overview with the background theory and information that you'll need for the laboratories that we have coming up. So that's why the lectures will be done prior to that experiment in the lab. So now as far as the laboratories go, this is going to be a mandatory attendance. Now I know this semester is a little bit different in the fact that there is the option for remote learning. So anybody who has opted for that, again, please contact me privately and we can make arrangements. I have virtual labs set up for all of these and data collection as well for all the labs. So you can still attend virtually and participate in the lab write-ups. For everybody else who has elected to be in person, your attendance is going to be mandatory, and you're going to be asked to bring your laboratory instructions with you. These are going to be, again, posted to Blackboard. I'll have those up for you in advance. Also bring your laboratory notebook. And reminder, this is something that will be graded at the end of the semester, so you'll need to scan in a copy of this and submit it to Blackboard at the end of the semester, so make sure you keep up to date with that. The other thing that we ask is please be ready for your lab sessions when you get there. Make sure that if you're in person, you get there on time, especially with the social distancing requirements. You'll have to make sure you're either in the laboratory or the remote viewing room and make sure you switch correctly to be prepared. Also, please view all of my live lectures, look through and read through all the documentation before you come to lab sessions. That way you're well prepared, you know what you're doing, you won't waste time during the laboratory part trying to learn things for the labs that you should have seen in the lectures, and you can move quickly through the laboratories because these are very time intensive, so it's going to take quite a bit of time, especially switching back and forth between 2 groups with the lab and the remote viewing room. Now for your lab notebook, what I'd ask you to do is get a composition notebook here. This is for you to provide a detailed chronicle of everything that occurs during the laboratories. Please, on each page, make sure you label and date each entry related back to whatever experiment you're doing and portion of that experiment. Again, this is to help keep you organized so you can reference back to this as you start doing your lab reports. So the more neat and organized it is, the better it is to help you do that. Within this, you should include the theory from lecture notes and handouts. So you say, okay, in lecture 2 on the 5th slide, I saw this relationship, this governing equation I'm going to use there, so you can quickly go back and utilize that when you're writing up your lab reports. What equipment was used, resolutions, short descriptions and drawings of your experimental setup, key procedural steps, data recorded, so what your data acquisition rate was, things like that. If there's any issues that went wrong, please note those for your lab report. Observations for what you saw happen, post-experimental data analysis and calculations. And if you want to either glue in or just hand sketch in a couple of graphs of what you think they should look like, or what you saw on some of the digital display outputs within the laboratory equipment. Another thing to know actually as you're doing this is it is important to keep the laboratory notebook, but also with technology, it would be nice as well if within this you took a lot of pictures as well of these laboratory setups, possible errors, descriptions of the equipment, so you can take a picture of the equipment and then put a description next to it. So some images would be great too, and those will be great to put into your lab reports. So let's talk a little bit about the lab write-ups. It's going to be 6 different labs, 6 different lab write-ups that you'll have due for the semester. So these reports are going to have due dates noted in the syllabus, course schedule, and on Blackboard. There'll be release dates and due dates for this. So there's no real reason for any of these to be late. And if they are late, you will lose points for it. So you're going to write up these reports as a group. You're going to assign roles, sections. Somebody may be doing the FEA analysis or the CAD drawing. Somebody might be doing the hand calculations. Somebody might be doing the actual write-up or the background and theory section. So whatever it is, make sure you assign your roles and sections to help divide and conquer the individual tasks for this lab write-up. Combine all of these sections together. Make sure it flows in a good manner. Double check each other's spelling, grammar, coherence. Check your units for your figures, your labeling, and your tables. Make sure you get it scanned in and posted up to Blackboard. Or if you're typing it out, just please submit it as a PDF. Usually works best, but Microsoft Word is also acceptable. And also make sure to note there's a peer review of the workload of the sharing of this workload. So at the end of your report, you can say, Johnny did this part, Sarah did this part, Joe did this part. Just so you know later on, if there is any issues when you do your peer evaluations, we can look back and see who was doing which portion of the lab write-up. So being that we are in a laboratory setting, safety becomes very, very important. There's a potential of getting injured within this. So please pay attention to any warnings, listen to the TAs, read through all the documentation before starting the experiment. There'll also be safety videos I have posted up to Blackboard as well. Please read through all of these before you attend your first laboratory. Another thing here in the lab, please don't bring any food or drinks in. Safety glasses when required. Make sure that you have closed-toed shoes, no sandals or open-toed shoes. Make sure if you have anything, longer hair ties, jewelry, things like that, they're tucked back or put away, not worn in the laboratory. And keep your cell phone usage to a minimum just so you're paying attention to each other and the equipment. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get into just a quick overview of each of the 6 laboratories that you're going to be going through. So the first laboratory you're going to have is Lab 1A and 1B, and this deals with photoelasticity. What we're going to be looking at specifically is some beam bending and strain visualization. Now within photoelasticity, some of the things you're going to be looking at within the lab are the fringe constant determination. So there's a lot of documentation within my lecture and with all the supplemental material that I've uploaded to Blackboard for you as well. A portion of this that's going to be very important is your calibration of the equipment as you set it up. And that's going to be the case for all of these labs and experiments you're working on. And also utilizing the correct test equipment. Again, so I can't stress this enough. Please read through the documentation, look through the lecture slides before coming to lab so you have a good understanding of how to utilize all of this. The laboratory TA will also be giving a brief lecture at the intro to the lab going over all of that and talking about the equipment as well. So lab 2, we're going to deal with lab 2 is beam deflection and free vibration. Some of the equipment that you're going to be utilizing within this lab is the strain gauges, your strain gauge amplifier, data acquisition equipment, and doing some spectrum analysis as well. So again, please read through all of the materials, become familiar with all of these, review back to some of your other courses that you've dealt with strain gauges in the past, how to apply these. Again, the TA will go over the details as well, but the more background information you have prior to going in, the more you're going to be able to get out of these laboratories. Lab 3, we're starting to deal with a pressurized cylinder. So this is going to be a pipe and pressure vessel analysis. So you can see here, this is the equipment that we're going to be utilizing here. We're going to have some strain gauge rosettes. You're going to need to learn how to use those or refresh yourself on how to use those and acquire data from them. And we're using Moore's circles and some principal stresses and strains for the data analysis. Now, as we get into lab 4 and 5 here, this is going to deal with heat treatment and hardening of some different material samples. So we're going to take a look at the ASTM standards for a geometry bar test, and we're going to utilize that within this laboratory for the experimental setup. The hardenability of steels by quenching, so we're dealing with some quenching relationships, equations, and calculations. We're also going to be talking about the Rockwell hardness testing, and we can see over here in this image here, our Rockwell hardness tester there that we're going to be utilizing on the samples. Now for the fifth lab here, this is going to be two parts, part A and B, and this is where we're going to be dealing with some tensile testing. So this is a really fun lab. We're going to be using an Instron machine that you can see up here. We have this right in the laboratory there for you guys. So we're going through, taking a look at some of the ASTM standards for tensile testing, look at a couple different material types here, 6061 aluminum, some 4031 steel, looking at the effects of quenching and tempering on the steel, and we're going to be comparing the results as you run the tension test on those different samples. And lastly, we're going to be using a standing electron microscope after we've pulled these samples and cracked them to take a look at the individual cracks in those samples close up. So lab six, what we're going to be dealing with here is fracture mechanics testing. So within this laboratory here, you can see some of the equipment that we'll be utilizing here. And this will be fatigue, crack propagation, looking at plane strain, fracture toughness, utilizing a couple different materials. So as I mentioned earlier, there's two main components to this course for ME 124. You have the lab section and the lecture section. The labs are scheduled to be in person in Vody building in room 246, and the lectures are scheduled for a remote modality, which means these are going to be synchronous remote format through Teams. So the classes will have an assigned meeting time for the lectures, but we'll meet online through Teams instead of in person. Now, that's for the lecture section. As I mentioned, the labs are going to be in person in Vody 246. So what I want to discuss now is the potential for changes in modality due to COVID this semester. So we're not planning on any, but I still want to be prepared in case this happens, and not only if the whole university switches to remote learning, but also if you test positive and need to quarantine and can't make it in person for these labs. I just want to let you know that I do have a plan in place to account for that. So a little bit of an overview of how I've set up this course. So I have a 15-week module. So I have 15 individual modules throughout the semester that are posted to Blackboard. Within these modules, I have a lot of supplemental information. I have each module is going to contain the weekly lecture slides, links to any type of supplemental information, assignments, video presentations, as well as anything else that's related to the lab sections and the lecture sections are all going to be posted up on Blackboard so you guys to access remotely. So my objective with these 15 modules throughout the semester is to provide the students with enough options to learn the material effectively, but not overwhelm you with too much material and too many different options. I've tried to organize this in a very neat fashion so you can step through those. And we'll be going through that in future lectures where I'll be going through Blackboard with you, showing you how everything is laid out and where everything is located. And again, outside of just our live lectures on Teams, I've also provided those weekly lecture slides and some video lectures for you as well. So there's a lot of resources for you that are still organized in a neat manner. So with that being said, these module templates allow me to keep the online course neat, organized, and easy for you to follow along so that you can spend your time learning the material rather than trying to navigate through an overwhelming amount of disorganized material. Now, please note, I do have office hours scheduled as well as our live lectures. So these live lectures are a great opportunity for any questions that you have. Come to the Teams live lectures for that face-to-face communication that you can ask any questions you may have. And one thing that I want to stress is if you're lost or confused on something, there's probably other students within the class that are having those same questions. So please reach out. And the beauty of Teams is that if you don't feel comfortable speaking out, raising your hand, turning your camera on, you can always type a little message in the chat to the side. I'm looking at those live when going through lectures, and I can address that when I see that chat come in and talk to the entire class about whatever that topic is. So this course, again, is broken into two different sections, the lecture and the laboratory experiments. Right now I want to focus on the laboratory experiments. So there's going to be 5 different lab sections with approximately 10 students in each of these lab sections, broken into Lab A01, A02, A04, A06, and A07. And you can see the corresponding days of the week and times that you'll be meeting with your group for these laboratory experiments. Now, something that we're going to discuss this semester is how we're going to break into groups for writing these lab reports. Now, in the past, I've done 2 different options. Sometimes I've let the entire group of 10 students be one lab group, and they can write together, divide up the tasks to write those reports, do the experiments together. Or what I've done in the past as well is broken these down into 2 separate groups. So for each of these 5 lab sections, they've broken into 2 separate groups of approximately 5 students each and wrote 2 lab reports. Now you'll still all 10 together running the experiment, but there's 2 different lab reports. This is something we're going to discuss and get your feedback on which of these 2 options you would like during the live lectures. So as we discussed earlier, the lecture portion of this class is already set up for remote live viewing through Teams. So there shouldn't be any issues if there's a change in modality during the semester for the lecture portion, as it's already set up to be remote through Teams. But the experiment lab section is set up to be in person. So what I have here is a tentative plan for remote attendance of these experimental labs if there's a change in modality or you're forced to quarantine. So what I have set up is I have 2 different cameras set up in the laboratory area. I have one that's covering the entire laboratory area, and I have one that's going to be focused in on the individual experiment itself. So you'll be able to see the whole classroom area, the whole lab room area, as well as the individual portion of the experiment that the other students in the lab are working on. Now, if you are of the circumstance where you need to quarantine and be remote for these labs, we have it set up so that you can go onto Teams and you can select one of these 2 cameras and make it your main primary view and go back and forth between those as you're viewing this remotely. So just like you would for any other Teams meeting, you can select on whatever camera you want and zoom in on that. There's only one microphone set up in the lab area, so you won't have to worry about feedback from that there. We have one high quality mic that'll be picked up, so you can listen in and view what's going on and kind of change your camera view so you can remotely participate in these laboratory experiments if you are forced to quarantine. So both of these cameras will be simultaneously live streaming to Teams in the circumstance that you have a student in quarantine. So you can be remote. Again, you could be in your dorm room, you could be back in your apartment. We do also have the potential for setting up a remote viewing room. That's something to be determined if we end up needing that, depending if there's a modality change or a limit or capacity limit set for the number of students allowed in the experiment lab. Again, these are not things that we're planning to have happen, but I do have a plan in place if they do happen. So just to get into a little bit more detail, if you are forced to go into quarantine and need to be fully online, we have this fully online at-home option. So students who have to quarantine or be off campus for this lab will be able to tune in to one of the lab sessions through Teams, and I encourage you to still go to your lab session with the rest of your teammates that you've already been assigned to and participate as an extra member of the team. So these lab experiments will be broadcast live, and again, as I mentioned, there's 2 different cameras, 2 different views. I've also, in addition to this, created virtual labs for remote students as well. So even though you're still able to tune in live and watch it and choose the view and listen in to the experiments, you can also go to the Blackboard page and watch the virtual lab for some more information for these labs. So these are pre-recorded virtual labs that are there for your resource if you have to quarantine or forced to be this at-home fully online option for one or multiple of these lab experiments. So these virtual labs are going to be posted to Blackboard along with the data and images from the lab. So not only the virtual lab videos, but also the data as well that you can access for these. Now, if you're forced to quarantine, you're still expected to contribute. So each team member will still need to contribute to the data reduction, analysis, and report writing. So even if you can't be in person for the lab experiments and you're doing this remotely, you still need to contribute equally to these lab report write-ups. And this is going to be viewed as fair participation as far as you're being remote and participating in the lab experiment section, but as far as the actual report, you still need to contribute and do your section of that laboratory report. So again, to kind of reiterate this, for these fully remote lab sections, if you're forced to quarantine, you can still watch the live transmission. The laboratory experience, again, will be broadcast live, those 2 camera views. This will be synchronous, or you can still, in my opinion, both of these are a great option to do together. You can watch that pre-recorded virtual lab video and still have access to the data through Blackboard. So even though you're not able to do the experiments yourself in person, you can still reduce the data, and you'll need to join the lab team, participate in observing the experiment remotely, but then also do the data reduction, analysis, and report writing. I know I've repeated myself on this, but this is something that is important. Just because you're in quarantine and you're watching virtually doesn't excuse you from writing these lab reports. You still need to contribute to the lab report write-up.